Iran tried to close the Strait of Hormuz, not with threats, not with a warning shot, with an actual declared closure, backed by mines, missiles, and a war that pulled in multiple countries across the region. The public version of this story is simple. Iran challenged the waterway, American firepower broke the challenge, and global trade resumed. Clean win for Washington. Story over. That version confuses military access with commercial recovery. What actually happened is messier and more interesting. Iran lost the fight for physical control of the strait. The United States forced the waterway back open by force, and neither side restored the world that existed before the first missile was fired. Everything in this video comes from documented military reporting, congressional cost tracking, and maritime insurance data from the actual conflict. We're going to walk through how Iran actually tried to pull this off, how the U.S. response actually unfolded, and why military victory and economic reopening turned out to be two completely different fights. Let's start with what actually happened on the ground, because this part gets lost. This wasn't a gray zone standoff. It was a real war, and it's worth understanding why Iran thought this plan could actually work in the first place. Iran didn't need to sink every tanker in the Gulf. Defense analysts had pointed out for years that a choke point strategy like this doesn't require total control. It just requires enough uncertainty that insurers, shippers, and energy firms start pricing Iranian permission into every voyage. Even a handful of mines, or the credible threat of them, can be enough to freeze a shipping lane that normally handles a fifth of the world's oil. Iran had reportedly signaled it could remotely control passage through offshore missile and drone positions along the coast. The geography of the strait, narrow and lined with Iranian territory on one side, was always the whole point. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated air and maritime campaign against Iranian command centers, IRGC infrastructure, missile sites, ships, submarines, and air defenses. Iran didn't quietly absorb it. On March 4th, Iranian forces formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed and backed that declaration up. They laid sea mines. They fired on ships. According to Pentagon and CENTCOM figures cited in wartime reporting, the fighting spread across multiple countries in the region within 48 hours, and by day 4, Iran had launched several hundred ballistic missiles and thousands of drones. Tanker traffic through the strait, normally 120 to 140 vessels a day, collapsed to as few as 8 to 10, and at the worst point of the war, to just a couple of tankers a day. This matters because it kills the lazy assumption that Iran was just posturing. A country that fires hundreds of missiles in 4 days and mines an active shipping lane isn't bluffing. Iran committed to this, and the operational logic behind it was sound. You don't have to win a naval battle to win the economic war. The closure was real, the war was real, and the economic shock was immediate. Which raises the actual question this video is about. If the intent was real and the logic was sound, why didn't it hold? What came back at Iran wasn't a proportional response. It was one of the most destructive naval campaigns of the modern era. The U.S. answer to the closure wasn't diplomacy first. It was overwhelming, sustained military force aimed specifically at Iran's ability to hold the strait. By early April, CENTCOM reported 155-plus Iranian naval vessels damaged or destroyed. On March 4th, in a separate action thousands of miles away in the Indian Ocean, a U.S. submarine sank the Iranian frigate Iris Dina, the first U.S. sinking of an adversary warship since World War II, a sign of how far the war had already spread beyond the strait itself. Closer to Hormuz, the U.S. dropped bunker buster bombs on hardened anti-ship missile sites along the strait and destroyed Iranian mine layers one by one. On April 9th, the destroyers USS Michael Murphy and USS Frank E. Peterson transited Hormuz with their AIS beacons, deliberately switched on a public signal that said, in effect, we're not hiding and we're not asking permission. On April 13th, the U.S. formally imposed a naval blockade on Iran itself. By May, The Pentagon had requested an $87.6 billion war supplement, with roughly $67 billion tied directly to the Iran campaign. Here's the part that's easy to miss. Destroying the threat and certifying a waterway safe are two different jobs. Sinking a mine layer doesn't tell you where the mines it already dropped are sitting. Military analysts warned at the time that unless Iran's fast boats stopped harassing clearance crews entirely, sweeping the strait under fire could take months, because it only takes a handful of undetected mines to keep insurers and shipowners treating the whole lane as unsafe, no matter how many Iranian vessels the Navy had already sunk. On paper, this is decisive. Sink the mines, sink the ships, force the strait back open. And for a moment, it looked like exactly that was happening. But here's the number that made this a harder story than it first appeared. Military dominance did not automatically restore commercial confidence. Those turned out to be two separate wars, running on two separate timelines. Here's the part that never made the highlight reel. While the Navy was winning battles at sea, the damage that actually reaches ordinary people, insurance costs, shipping delays, fuel prices had already been locked in, and no airstrike could undo it on a schedule. Wars over choke points don't just cost lives and hardware. They reprice risk across the entire global economy instantly, and that repricing doesn't reverse the moment the shooting slows down. War risk insurance premiums on Hormuz transits jumped from roughly 1 to 3% of hull value before the conflict to 7.5 to 10%. During it, some reports put it as high as 3 to 10%, depending on the route. A $100 million tanker that used to pay around $250,000 in war risk premium was suddenly paying $3 to $10 million for a single transit. Brent crude, which sat around $65 to $71 before the war, spiked to near $120 a barrel once the fighting started. That forced the IEA to coordinate a record 400 million barrel strategic reserve release, with the U.S. contributing the largest single share. It helps to see how that number actually travels. A missile strike or a mine report doesn't touch your gas tank directly, it moves through a chain. First, insurers reprice the war risk premium on that specific route. Then shipowners pass that premium into the freight rate they charge. Then oil traders fold the higher freight cost into the delivered price of crude. Then refiners pay more to acquire that crude, and that cost eventually shows up at the pump, thousands of miles from the strait itself. By the time a driver in Ohio notices it, the actual military event that caused it may be old news. That lag is exactly why insurance is the more honest scoreboard for this war than any casualty count. This is the part that doesn't show up in a military scoreboard. Iran didn't need to permanently hold the strait to inflict damage, it just needed enough chaos to make insurers, shippers, and oil traders price the danger into every future transit. Once that repricing happens, it doesn't just snap back because the Navy declares the mine's cleared. But here's the number Washington could not explain away. The U.S. was spending tens of billions of dollars to protect a supply route it barely used. Here's the detail that made this war politically awkward at home, and it's rarely mentioned in the same breath as the military headlines. In 2024, the U.S. imported only about 0.5 million barrels per day of Gulf oil through Hormuz, roughly 7% of total U.S. oil imports, and about 2% of total U.S. consumption. That's the lowest level of Hormuz dependence in 40 years, mostly thanks to domestic production and Canadian imports. Meanwhile, the Pentagon was reporting a war cost of $37.5 billion and counting. On top of that, pending $87.6 billion supplemental request. The U.S. wasn't fighting primarily to protect its own physical oil supply. Its direct exposure to Hormuz shipments was relatively small, but because oil is priced in a global market, disruptions still threatened American fuel prices indirectly. That's a harder story to tell than, we're defending our own oil. The U.S. was really defending the system everyone else depends on. China's 5.4 million barrels a day, the flow to India, South Korea, Japan, the entire structure of seaborne energy trade. That gap between direct exposure and indirect stakes is exactly what critics in Congress pointed to when they questioned the cost. So did that spending actually buy a return to normal? The ceasefire is where that question gets tested, and the answer isn't the one Washington wanted. This is the part of the story that breaks the U.S. wins, credits roll narrative completely. The ceasefire didn't actually close the book. On June 17, 2026, the U.S. and Iran signed a ceasefire memorandum, including a 60-day toll-free period for transit through Hormuz. Shipping cautiously resumed. Saudi Arabia reportedly pushed roughly 34 million barrels through the strait over 2 weeks, clearing its wartime backlog. But by July, hostilities flared again. Iranian strikes hit tankers, including 2 UAE supertankers. On July 11th, the IRGC ambushed a Cyprus-flagged container ship and declared the strait would remain closed until the end of American interventions. The U.S. retaliated with another wave of strikes on Iranian targets. By late July, industry estimates put Hormuz traffic at only around 8.5 million barrels per day, still far below the pre-war norm of roughly 15 million. Daily ship counts stayed volatile, as low as 8 vessels on June 28th, up to around 16 by July 1st. It's worth being precise about what recovery even means here, because the barrel count and the ship count tell slightly different stories. A strait can carry meaningful volume with relatively few vessels if the ships making the trip are large tankers running full, which is part of what happened as operators who did brave the transit sent their biggest, most valuable ships rather than smaller, more frequent ones. That's not a sign of normality. It's a sign that most operators were still too nervous to send anything at all, and the ones who did were concentrating risk onto fewer, larger targets. A ceasefire that gets violated within a month, on a strait still running well below its normal volume, 5 months after the ceasefire was supposed to restore normal transit, is not a return to the pre-war system. Iran showed it could keep probing the agreement at a lower cost to itself than the United States was paying, just to maintain the security response needed to hold the line. And underneath the ceasefire, the missiles and the insurance numbers, there's one more bill nobody was watching in real time: the cost of just keeping the corridor open long after the headlines moved on. The visible warships sunk, missiles fired, dollars spent during active combat is only part of the ledger. The cost of holding a reopened corridor doesn't end when the fighting slows. Maintaining a sustained mine clearance and blockade campaign strained a U.S. Navy that now runs around 280 commissioned warships, compared to roughly 600 in 1980, pulling assets away from other theaters just to keep pace in the Gulf. The campaign burned through more than 1,000 Tomahawk cruise missiles, which defense analysts have described as the largest recorded expenditure of that weapon in its history, alongside large quantities of Patriot and THAAD interceptors, stockpiles that some assessments suggest could take until 2029 to rebuild. And the insurance market itself was structurally reshaped. War risk rates that spiked during the conflict haven't simply reset to pre-war levels, because insurers now have a live case study of exactly how bad it can get and exactly how fast. That's the part that should worry planners more than the headline numbers. Every ship, missile, and interceptor committed to keeping Hormuz open was an asset unavailable somewhere else, and the Navy's own planning has spent years focused on the Western Pacific, not the Gulf, as the theater where a much larger fight might actually happen. A choke point war that drains the exact stockpiles built for a different, bigger contingency is a cost that doesn't show up on any wartime invoice, but it doesn't disappear either. This is the actual bill for reopening a strait through force. It's not just what was spent during the war, it's a stretched Navy still covering the gap, depleted stockpiles that take years to rebuild, and an insurance market now repriced for a risk it can no longer treat as remote. None of that ends when the missiles stop. So here's where this actually lands. Iran tried to close Hormuz for real, with mines, missiles, and a declared blockade that lasted months. The U.S. answered with one of the most destructive naval campaigns of the modern era, sinking a warship, destroying over 150 Iranian vessels, and forcing a ceasefire. On the battlefield, that is a decisive outcome. But decisive on the battlefield didn't mean decisive everywhere else. Shipping still hasn't returned to normal. Insurance costs are still elevated. Iran kept testing the ceasefire within weeks of signing it. And the U.S. spent tens of billions of dollars plus stockpiles it will spend years rebuilding, defending a flow of oil that barely touches its own fuel supply, only to end up holding a strait still running well below its pre-war capacity. Iran lost control of the waterway. The United States won military access. But neither side restored the world that existed before the first missile was fired. And if there's one thing this whole episode proves, it's that in a world this connected, you don't need to win a war to change how the entire planet does business. You just need to make everyone nervous enough to price it in.